Ladies and gentlemen, the Philippine National Anthem.
Bayang magiliw, peles ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hiniran, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupi, di ka pasisingil, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bagaw, may dinagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kislat ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdilingling, ang bituin at araw niya kailan, pang may di magdidilim, lupa ng araw ng wala natin pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang bibigaya na pa ay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Glory to you, Almighty, for gathering us today. Give us the fortitude to conquer life's challenges, so we can excel and be upright in everything that we do. Guide us to be united in diversity, that we may continue to serve and love one another. Amen.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Tamaraos. Welcome to our 94th Foundation Week Anniversary webinar for this afternoon, entitled Comics and Cartoons During the Japanese Occupation. I'm Ron Gascon, a faculty member from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Institute of Arts and Sciences, and I'll be your MC and moderator this afternoon. I'm sure we're all excited and ready for another enriching opportunity for us to learn and understand more about our history and how it connects to the present society. We're grateful and honored to be joined by our resource speaker, and I am really honored to introduce him later in the program. You may also engage with our speaker later in our Q&A and open forum segment after his talk. May also remind everyone to keep your microphones on mute to avoid any interruptions. To formally start our program and to give us the welcoming remarks, may I call on our Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Maria Teresa Trinidad Tino. Hi, Ma'am Trina. Good afternoon. The screen is yours, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Ron, and hello, Karl. Thank you for being here today. I will have to ask the apologies of everyone in the room, especially Karl, because my own field is also I'm not really a historian, but I have done research that's history related, so I have quite a bit of some things to say, prior. So I'm going to take up a little bit of, I won't give you a lecture. I will introduce really the relevance of this talk to our beloved students. So I'm very happy that there are 400 students here today. So this is our foundation week. our foundation week is always actually centered around, it's scheduled always around today, February 9, because today is also the death anniversary of the founder of FEU, Dr. Nicanor Reyes. So today is always for FEU, always a very important day. And if this were if we were at face-to-face, normally on Feb 9, what we do is we have prayers that are in all of the classrooms, and then we ask the teachers to just a very short prayer to say that prayer before the start of the class in memory of our founder. So I'd like to just share a few thoughts just to make this all relevant for you, because I have 6 things to say. So I listed it here. So it's not really a lecture. It's really an explanation of why this is relevant to us. So the first point that I'd like to make, but I think I'd like to share a screen, which I just copied from the internet last night, but I just wanted to make a point. I'm not sure. I will try to share my screen. Share screen and desktop. Files. It's not happening. Can I ask Kathy na lang to help me share the screen that I sent? Kathy or...
Yes, Leslie. On it.
Thanks. Okay, so the screen that I'd like to share is just really a timeline from 1941 to 1945 of the key events of the war in the Pacific. So the first point that I'd like to make is that the war, so our founder died in 1945, which was 77 years ago. And for many of us, myself included, I'm much older than the students who are here, but even for me, that's such a long time ago, no? Parang I cannot really imagine. I mean, I can imagine from stories of my lola, diba? But you guys, you're much younger, so your lolas are probably closer to my age than my lola, no? So my lola still had stories, so I can still imagine what life was like then. So and yet it's important for us, as I'm sure you've always heard, no, to be in touch with our history, to know what has happened to us. So we're going to talk about something that happened almost 80 years ago. So that's my first point. My second point was I'd like to show you this timeline. I'd like to show you how World War II happened in the Pacific. Because we in the Philippines, we were part of the Pacific War. Because if you know, maybe you don't know, because a lot of my students, I'm always surprised to find out, they don't know much about World War II. They confuse it sometimes with the Vietnam War or things like that, no? So you, maybe some of you know, but some of you might not know that there were wars in several fronts. One was in Europe, and that's what's talked about, the Nazi occupation of Europe and the killing of the Jews. But there was also a Pacific War, which is what affected us. So I'd like to show you how it happened, right? So I downloaded the file that shows you the most important dates of World War II in the Pacific. Okay, so for us, it began in December 7, 1941, no, when that's the date that Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was attacked by the Japanese, and they also attacked the Philippines. So it started in December. But if you look at the dates here, for us in the Philippines, December must have been a very intense month because everything happens in December. It starts December 7, 20 days later, December 26, Manila is already an open city, meaning to say, wala na, tapos na, no? It's defenseless already. When you declare that you're an open city, you say, Manila, we can't defend ourselves, the Japanese have taken over, and we've accepted it. So in a matter of 20 days, it's kind of over for us in the Philippines, okay? So we can scroll up, Kathy, if you can scroll up, you will see this has dates that happen in 42, 43. There's not much that's highlighted in yellow because there's not much anymore that's relevant to the Philippines. Sige, if you just keep scrolling, see, like in 42, not much is relevant to us. Here, there's in 42, the order of MacArthur to get out of the Philippines. But, you know, for an ordinary person, that's just like what's happening to some military people. That's not really anything that's happened to like people who lived during that time. The details that you'll get in 42, 43, 44 all have to do with military, you know, attack in Bataan. You've heard probably of the death march from Bataan all the way up to Tarlac, I think. They walk from Bataan to Tarlac. So that's a very famous death march, Corregidor. These things happening in 42, right? But for ordinary people, you know, no more na. Manila's an open city. So if we keep going, 42, 43, 44, you'll see there's hardly any more highlighted, meaning to say, all of what's happening is happening in the other parts, in Singapore, happening in even parts of Australia, in the islands around the Philippines, in Malaysia. See, nothing happening, nothing highlighted. 42. We can keep going. 43, not much, no yellow highlights. So nothing happening in the Philippines from 42, 43, even 44, not much, right? 44, not much. See, nothing. It's all happening in the islands, right? 44, nothing. They're in 44 in October. There's the beginning, Leyte, the Battle of Leyte. I think this is when MacArthur, if you've ever been to the place that I shall return, I think that's in, tama ba? That's in Leyte, okay? No, that's down. Okay, anyway, see, Karl, I don't even know so much of the details of my. So nothing much, nothing much. 45. Now this is where we start to get. We can stop here, 45. So if you recall, for the Philippines, the war for ordinary people, everything happens in 20 days. December 8th, they start to attack. By December 26th, Manila's an open city. Well, there's nothing much anymore. So for us, you accept that you're occupied by the Japanese. Nothing much happens in 42, 43, 44. The beginning of 45, the Americans start to return. So you see in January 9th, the US in Lingayen, they're making their way to Luzon. By February 3, the US 6th Army attacked the Japanese in Manila. I know that I'm very aware. There's a very famous point, and I think it might be this one, around February 3, that when the Americans came back to Manila, and we in here in FEU are very much a part of it, the Japanese had occupied UST and FEU. They had made it their either maybe their hospital, their barracks, but they had occupied these schools and they maybe their offices, right? So that when the Americans came back, there's apparently a very famous return right down. I imagine it was going this way from Quezon City. I'm not sure. Right down España. So it's supposed to be a very famous return of the Americans. Like they came back in many jeeps or trucks and tanks, maybe going down España to retake UST, FEU from the Japanese. So my point about mentioning that is that even if this is so far away, we're still so much connected to that time, in that we are actually in the buildings that house the Japanese, house the Filipinos who were there. There was fighting in this where we are, in our school, right? So that happened in early January. By February, remember the date of the death of our founder is February 9. So if you see, by February 3, 1945, the U.S. Army already attacks the Japanese in Manila. So in about a month's time, they're coming in, they attack the Japanese. And what happens here is the Japanese at this point, they know that they've lost. I don't know if you know this story, but it's pretty famous, that the Japanese know that they've lost. It's like a suicide mission for them. And maybe Karl can correct me. I'm not sure if this is accurate, but the way we're told about what happened is that knowing that they were going to lose, and that they went on a killing spree. They just went down. So there are many people who recount, and included there is the family of our founder. They went on a killing spree down Taft Avenue, for example, and in the Manila area. They just went and raided and killed Filipinos who they saw. They just killed left and right, thousands of people for no reason. You were just there, you happened to cross their path, and you were killed. And that's how our founder was killed. He was the founder of FEU, had a house, I think it was in the Taft area. And our chair emeritus, Lourdes Montinola, the daughter of our founder, is still alive, and she's still very active here in FEU, so she's still very connected. She was actually a witness to the death of her father. She was in the room, and when her father hid her behind a closet, and then the Japanese killed the father, our founder, in her presence. So these events are so far away, and yet we're still so connected to them. So again, my point is for Filipinos. Oh, sorry. My point number 4 is I want to take a minute just to talk about who Nicanor Reyes was. No? Because when I read up about him, I find inspiration in him because he founded FEU 17 years before he died, and he had this vision about UP was already ahead. No, UP was already up. There were a few other schools that were up, but our founder had this vision of setting up a school for the working class and even for working students. No, and we now in FEU, so it was kind of a good vision, a very visionary, because there were no schools at the time that were, or very few schools that were going to offer that, no, for working class people and working students. And it's a legacy that we now in FEU like to uphold. We like to, when we talk about our direction and how we should go, even when we talk about tuition, we always remember the founder and the intention of the founder, and we try to keep that spirit in our hearts when we think about the direction of FEU today. Even if this was 94 years ago, that spirit is still very important to us now. Okay, so so again, I'd like to say, that if you go through the that's it. No, it ends in 45. That's fine. We don't need to go. The liberation is that right. A little around 45. Can you go back up to February? The point that I'd like to make was just to say that in 41, in a matter of 20 days for the regular Filipinos, life changed in 20 days, right? From being, we were still under the Americans at the time, but in 20 days, we were all of a sudden bombed. There were a lot of buildings that were bombed. There were many deaths. I think I had a grand uncle who died during that time. And in 20 days, life turned around and changed. But for the ordinary Filipino between 40, 41 and 45, we don't know much of what happened. And then in 40, 45, again, a lot of changes. Okay, so point 5 I'd like to say is that we're very used to traditional history, and traditional history is very much like this this timeline. We talk about military wars and generals and attacks and occupations and things like that. But what happens in between? Like what happened in the Manila in 42, 43, 44? There's not much, it doesn't say much anymore about life in the Philippines for those 3 years. So the newer history is interested in things like that. What happens? Like it's not the grand stories of generals and wars, but what happens during those periods? I'd like to share with you one little thing. My own mom was born in October 1942, right? So I'm always thinking, oh my God, what were my grandparents doing? Imagine, she was conceived after the bombing of Manila, kasi October 42 eh. So parang, I always think of that, parang, what a time. I mean, I think of myself, if there was a war going on, the last thing I would ever think about, make sure, is that I will not have children, because what a time to have children come into the world. So, but my mom was born October of 42. So that always tells me, so yeah, life was terrible, but life went on. Diba? People still got pregnant, people still fell in love, people still gave birth, people still ate. My grandmother, there were stories of how they had very little rice and all that, but life went on, right? So that's my introduction. I'm sorry I took so long, but my point really is just to say that with the talk today, it's something that we will look at life in between the grand moments, right? It's very interesting to think about, like, okay, so what were people reading and what were they thinking, and that's what our talk today will bring. Okay, so Thank you so much, Karl, for gracing our event, our annual event. We have this every year. And thank you all of the students, 450 by now, no, who have come to listen to this talk. I hope you will learn something, but also really appreciate our founder and our own connection to history. And I hope you'll be interested to look up history and seek its relevance to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, SVP Trina Trino, for such an informative and insightful opening message. And of course, for letting us understand again the importance of revisiting our past, especially during the Pacific War and the Japanese occupation, and how it's actually connected to us being FEU or part of the FEU community. I'm sure our students here are now more enticed to listen and learn from our webinar this afternoon. On that note, let me introduce our guest speaker this afternoon. He is an assistant professor of the Department of History and former director of the Japanese Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University. He authored COVID-19 and Popular Culture in Southeast Asia Digital Responses to the Pandemic for Kyoto University Center for Southeast Asian Studies, COVID Chronicles series, and the Japanese representation in Philippine media as a section for the Paigrave Handbook of Ethnicity. He has been an Asia Public Intellectual Junior Fellow and is currently a Japan Foundation Japanese Studies Fellow. Is also part of the editorial board of the Social Sciences Diliman and East Asian Journal of Popular Culture. He is a steering committee member of the Japanese Studies Association of Southeast Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, on your screen, our resource speaker, Professor Karl Cheng Chua. Sir, thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon. The screen is yours, sir.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for the kind introduction. I also would like to thank Tina for the very for that very wonderful summary as well. Part of the reason that I envy the people, the universities in Manila, because the World War II history in Ateneo is nothing, because Katipunan was just bush during that time. So in terms of commemoration, there wasn't much. So but one of the reasons why I also appreciate doing this talk is because it does relate to what Trina had already mentioned, a problem that we have in history. History is supposed to history is about assessing and reassessing periods in our pasts. And despite the fact that for young students like yourself, this might be a distant past for you, it also is about trying to exercise whether this has meaning, and in your case, being part of a university that has a World War II history creates meaning into it. We had in the past vibrant history textbooks and vibrant histories to which it tried to make Filipinos realign and try to make them understand their pasts. These are just a few. Unfortunately, the part of the problem that we have is the history has unfortunately sort of hit a stop gap, in the sense that we have stopped doing these types of general histories which realign or at least reassess our pasts, right? It doesn't mean that there are no excellent scholars of World War II. There are. What I'm trying to work with here is the problems of general history. And thankfully, FEU, Public Policy Center, actually hosted an awesome talk by Professor Maris Diokno, and she actually addresses part of this problem. And I took this as a screen cap because it tells you about the current state of general history education in the Philippines. When you look at it, the problem that we have here is we tend to still focus on a very post-colonial nationalist concept of our Philippine history. And that is why a lot of chunk of our Philippine history is concentrated on pre-colonial and Spanish colonial period. So what happens, as you can even see here in this very linear slide by the team of Dr. Jokno, um, the 20th century is really compacted into a short period of time as opposed to the Spanish colonial and the pre-colonial period. So what does it do? Unfortunately, this creates a bum deal for World War II. Why? Because as Trina had actually presented, World War II in the Philippines started late 1941. We feel it in 42 and we end at 45. So hence, Japanese occupation period in the Philippines was only about 3 years, 3 to 4 years. And what does that mean? It means that the questions to ask about the relevance of World War II within our own society, within our own spaces, becomes limited. And you would find that we hardly, even in our national histories, we would hardly find anyone that we would identify as part of the World War II stories as an individual, right? We can easily name names for Spanish colonial, American colonial, or even in the martial law period, but we can't really have that within World War II itself. And hence, not that I'm saying that it is important, but because of the way we have arranged our educational system in history, it sort of compacts the idea instead of what we did before. We were arguing. There were historians that were writing, historians that were arguing who was more important, historians that were then reshifting our pasts and our knowledge, our understandings of our pasts. So, as what Ma'am Trina had mentioned, World War II is always used, always known as a war period. And when I was a student a long time ago as well, I hate war. And I hated all of my war freak students, or no, my war freak classmates that would talk about, oh, this tank, these guns, and so on. And what resonated to me was the question really of what was life like, because when you unpack all of these deaths, when you unpack all of these combat events, you have to also understand that there was a life that was happening during these war periods. And admittedly, during that time, I was a very lazy history major, in the sense that I didn't want to read a lot of memoirs. It doesn't help as well that I'm not from Manila. I'm actually from Iloilo, and hence, Filipino reading Filipino sucks for me. So one of the ways I then tried to understand, or try to look for new stories about World War II, was to look at it from what people were consuming. And up to probably when President Duterte was elected, I could have confidently said that comics is still a popular culture, is a popular culture medium in the Philippines. We now see that there's a shift towards this. And when we then look at comics has actually been used not only by artists, the comic artists themselves, but even intellectuals, government institutions, in order to promote particular projects that they have. What you see here is an anti-dengue campaign in various formats, from popular culture comics to even just DOH campaigns in the past. Right. So in other words, what you see here is an effective use of a media, and hence, even during World War II itself, we are not looking at a media that Filipinos were experimenting in, but was already a medium to which Filipinos were already playing with and were familiar with. The other thing is, it's in terms of influence, it's actually quite it has a very large influence in the sense that you do not need a lot of proficiency, a lot of literacy in order to consume it. In other words, comics up to a particular point, your parents, oh no, your parents are probably of a younger generation that already reads comics. But in my generation, comics was seen as childish. But comic studies then tells you that even for Filipinos, then it did not have an age limit. In other words, children, adults were able to actually read it. And their reading depended on their literacies. You can look at it in the pictures. If you have the literacies of reading words, then you can actually add into it. And if you can then add, the movement, the panel layout, you can actually add into your interpretations, right? So I chose comics because it was a curious concept, and I liked it. I also read comics when I was growing up. Then the point now is to look for comics during that period. And unfortunately, when the Japanese entered the Philippines, one of the things that they actually did was then close a lot of the media spaces in order to limit the type of information that was going to come out. And once they had settled in, they had limited their spaces into particular newspapers. In my case, I only looked at print. It's easy. It's a little bit static. There was also radio. There was also movies during this time, but I didn't want to deal with that then. And access to movies during that period was a little bit difficult. So what I chose was the Tribune. One, because it's the only English newspaper, and hence I could easily read it. It's part of the TVT chain by Alejandro Roses. This is basically the same people as the Lopezes currently right now, and you're able to access all of them there. Why is it TVT? Because you have Taliba, which is their Filipino version newspaper, which I cannot read because it's in literary Filipino, and to ask a Nilongo to read literary Filipino is a bad idea. Right? Spanish, but I wasn't really as good in Spanish as well, so I chose the more simple one, which is Tribune. The nice thing about the structure is, despite the fact that this was controlled by the propaganda corps, the local staff remained intact. In other words, the people that were writing, even the artists themselves, were Filipino. And why did I choose this? Number one, in the war, when there was that media glut, a lot of Filipinos were actually hungry for knowledge, for news. And with the banning of radios, with not much information coming, media blackout during that period, anything was something important for them, and hence newspapers was easily circulated. Furthermore, the advantage of newspapers is, I'm not sure if, well, for the kids, I'm not sure if you've had this experience, but for my generation, the generation before that, you kind of shared. It's either comics, books, and so on. There was a generation where you could rent comics. There was a generation where you could also rent newspapers instead of buying them. And hence, as a paper product, you were able to then distribute it and read it and redistribute it. The other thing is, they did know that it was a highly censored newspaper because it was monitored by the propaganda corps, and it was recorded by a lot of World War II scholars in the Philippines that what the Filipinos would basically do is just read the opposite. So if the Japanese reported that they killed, that they destroyed 100 American planes, the Filipinos would read, okay, it means that the Americans actually destroyed 100 Japanese planes and so on. So it was all of this subterfuge that was now happening with the readership themselves. The other thing is that there were funny instances when you look at the memoirs, because part of the reason why they were also excited to get their newspapers was especially for the tinderas, and especially for the ones that were selling goods during this period. There was a severe shortage of paper, and hence they actually wanted to get these newspapers because it was wrapping paper for their products, whatever it was, for dyeing, or even during that time when you had a very bad smoking habit, then they used the newspapers as paper to roll their tobacco. So, but to me, I read it basically as an excitement of the space to consume the newspapers. Um, there were comics during this period, and contrary to what we knew, despite the fact that there was supposed to be it was supposed to be a propaganda newspaper, even as late as 1942, the Tribune was still publishing a lot of American comics, Donald Duck, Tarzan, Andy Cap, and the Phantom. Part of the reason here is, well, if you're interested in art, in comic art cultures, production and art production is difficult, and hence to abruptly stop this, you would need fillers for the newspapers itself. And during that time, with the nationalism trends of propaganda by Japanese occupation period, it was the Filipinos were still not yet there in terms of mass production. So they allowed these American comics to be published, but the storylines had to be moderated. They had to be safe. Mhm. So, what were the comics that were there? I was able, and if you're into Philippine comics history, the interesting thing here is that World War II is seen in Philippine comic history as a blank spot. In other words, most comic authors, most comic historians would tend to say that there was nothing, and that was something that I was like, I found odd, because people that produce, artists that produce, there was still art during this period. And I tried to look for it, and I was luckily enough able to find it in the English newspaper. There are four comics, or I generally categorize them all as comics, but if you want to look at it from a more aesthetic perspective, you'll see how different they are. First one is Philosopher of the Sidewalk by Gat, Liborio Gat Banton. We'll talk about him in a bit. And it was from 25 January to 16 August 1942, 29 comics. Now I've seen everything. I still don't know who this guy is. He's Ross. Only has 4 comics from 12 July to 23 August 1942. The Boy Filipino, the only Japanese manga artist here, is Keizo Shimada with 18 comic strips from only in January of 1943. And of course, if you're into Filipino comics, Tony Velasquez would actually draw 46 comics from 1943 to 1944, right? So what was I then going to do with this? Okay, now that I know that they were there, so you have to now try to understand what it means. Of course, the first thing that a lot of Filipino historians would tend to look at is because it's in a propaganda tool, and hence it's supposed to present to you propagandic messages, right? This is by Ross. Ross would always illustrate in this type of format, single panel with a very busy single panel, multiple illustrations, and very busy in terms of its texts. And here, what you have is Filipinos now trying to learn Japanese. And of course, we do know from World War II history that the Japanese were trying to remove all influences of all American influences within their spaces. That was why they were now trying to promote Filipino or Tagalog as a more common use by Filipinos. So to remove all the Western qualities within our spaces. But at the same time, they were trying to teach the Filipinos Nipongo during that time, or Nihongo. And what you see here is the kids are easily able to pick it up. Language proficiencies for kids are quite there. You'd also have, although it's not actually shown here, it's not clearly shown here. Watashi wa anata o aishimasu. I love you. And part of the way they wanted to present this is, oh, if you learn this language, it's a secret language to wish your lola when you do when you do mandidiga with your girlfriend would not understand because your lola probably just understands Spanish. So these types of interesting, funny takes, but it also is presenting concepts of propaganda that's there. What you also see here is a textbook that was published during this period of Nipongo that was specifically to Filipinos. You have Jose Rizal there, you have Philippine flag, and so on. And they started with, and what's curious here, if you're into language pedagogy, is they start with katakana because they thought of us as foreigners, not as nationals. Keijo Simada, Boy Filipino, would also use this as well as part of his propaganda. I only chose this because I found it fascinating that even the onomatopoeia, the sounds in the comics, is actually Japanese. So instead of the Z's when you snore, it's actually Google, which is the Japanese onomatopoeia. And of course, even in the newspapers themselves, you'd also have very small sections of Japanese language learning. And during this period, you were not only looking at formal education, they were trying to force kids into school, but the radio stations would also have Japanese language programs during that period as well. So there was a multimedia barrage of people learning Japanese. But of course, it was not going to be as successful. Another propaganda here is Radio Taisha, an exercise. It's basically the morning exercise. I don't see this anymore with this generation, but I also came from a Chinese school, and in Chinese school we always have this as our PE. So it's not uniquely Japanese, but it's also part of their cultural influence that they wanted to regulate the daily lives of Filipinos, and hence there's going to be Radio Taisho as well during that time. But aside from comic information, when you look at it in its entirety, what's interesting is you're then able to see the spaces to which artists are now trying to subvert the messages that are there. The Philosopher of the Sidewalk by Gat, what you see here are food lines because there was a massive food shortage because of the trade embargoes imposed against the Japanese during this period, and there was a lot. There was a shortage of supplies. And what's interesting here is the audacity of the philosopher saying, okay, they're giving you rations of rice, but is there something else? It creates this funny concept, at least, where in a period when there was not much choice, this person has the gall to actually ask if there was something else. But similar to what Mamtrina had also mentioned, why I actually presented this is that when you then look at other sources, I show you here another research that I do with children's memoirs during this period. There is also a gap. In other words, the experiences of Filipinos were varied. While some Filipinos were actually hungry during this period, there were some Filipinos, such as Pasita Jacinto, who did not experience this hunger. Because she did come from the upper middle class. She's in I can't remember which part of the Philippines she is, but it wasn't really a war zone as much, or she was treated well during that period. So it creates this interesting conversation. As opposed to just the current flat concept that we have of World War II, where, oh, it was war, it was awful, the Japanese were raping and killing all of these people, So it's about trying to understand the diversity of this space. A shortage of supply was also there. One of the supplies that was also quite we tend to take for granted is soap. Well, oil that was then going to be produced for soap. And Ross had made alternatives like, kung wala kang sabon na panglaba, edi putulin mo yung mga pantalon mo para mas konti lang yung lalabahan mo, right? And then mas sexy daw yung itsura ng mga lalaki pag they have short shorts. So it's an interesting take on a shortage of supply, and the arguments towards how men were also trying to be vain because nahihiya din yung mga lalaking magpakita ng balbon nilang paa. They're shaving their legs as well now that they're doing short shorts, right? In the same way that during this time you also had again stories of people that did not have in this one by Barbara Ann Gamboa Lewis. She also mentions that she did not experience this as much because she is from the peripheries of Manila itself. So it creates again this question of so where did we derive our narratives for our general World War II stories come from? When we talk about this, especially for me, when I study World War II, it's always about a period when there was nothing, right? There is also part of how the Japanese wanted to ensure that Filipinos forgot about the shortage of supply was to encourage Filipinos to replace or to have replacements for everyday materials. Glass was a very we would think that right now when you drink your beers and then you throw it, it's nothing, right? But glass during that time was such a precious material because there was not much production. It was used to not only carry your suka or toyo that you bought in tingi because it was in a shortage during that time, and because there were no factories during that period. When you broke it, it was like a bad thing. And Tony Velasquez would say, oh, why don't you go ethnic with bamboo? But of course it also tells you about the problems when with bamboo containers. If you look at it from a science perspective, it's actually like a little BS because it's porous, and hence slowly it's not going to be a very good long-term container, and plus it will influence whatever you put inside it. I'm also showing you here a article by I also found it as one of my comics, but I didn't show it for this one. The Japanese were also encouraging a lot of Filipinos to do backyard gardens during that time. It's I think another policy of one of the current presidential candidates right now to use all plots of lands just to produce food. And that was also a policy that we're doing, without realizing that you can't really produce as much. Yes, if you can be a plantito right now with household plants, but not for food-bearing plants. It's going to be not as productive as you'd like it to be. Philosopher of Sidewalk would also show you this, where if you look at the newspapers, there'd be advertisements for fresh milk, there'd be advertisements for powdered milk, there'd be advertisements for fruits and vegetables. But the problem here is that there was a shortage of supply, right? So the question is, yes, there is this, but can people actually have access to it? And that was what I sort of read the comics as subversion. In other words, it seems safe in the eyes of the censors, but in reality, if you're a Filipino experiencing this glut, experiencing the shortage, then you also not only read the fun of it, but also realize that this is the current state that we're in, the current bad state that we're in. I like using this. Sorry, it's not as clear because this was copied in microfilm. Subversion in the sense that yes, there were restaurants during that period, but restaurants were also using a lot of replacement meats, and this is probably one of the earliest times that I've actually seen a reference to Miao Pao, because what you see here is okay, this guy is now buying Shao Pao in this restaurant, and then the last column, they say, oh no, they're replacing the chicken and the beef with cat. So I'm like, oh wow. It sounds funny, but it's also showing you the realities of the space. Interviews during this period would talk about the desperations of Filipinos who would not slaughter their already aging draft animals because they'd rather get it for its milk. It was more useful when it was even on the last legs of its life as opposed to killing it for its meat. And hence they looked for food substitutions. Like during that time, there was a very robust consumption of cat and mouse, rats. But Filipinos would hardly identify it because a lot of our foods were pretty much stew based, and hence you see chunks but you won't identify what they are, right? So you see here as part of that subversive elements, right? So this was basically my research in 2005 when I was still studying for my GASP MA. But when I was invited to this talk, I sort of wanted to develop this idea further because it wasn't just about creating an alternative to how the stories were there, because we do see them as part of the memoirs. If you read World War II memoirs, when Mantrina would interview her relatives, even my relatives as well, you'd hear these stories, right? But I wanted to push the medium further, and that was why part of my research was now looking at not only comics but also children's medium. Surprisingly, DIY was also allowed to be published during this period. DIY, to the kids who don't know, is one of the primary literary newspapers that still exists up to the present. The nice thing about it is that DIY is also translated into a lot of major languages in the Philippines, not only Tagalog, even we have Ilonggo as well. We also have Waray, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of these translations, and DIY was actually used as a propaganda tool to emphasize American cultural influence in the Philippines. That's why DIY would actually be the space where you have a lot of writers. Writers that, if I have lit majors here, Filipino lit greats would write in this space. So it was an interesting conversation that they were able to thrive, not taking out from the picture that we also had a lot of great literary writers during the American colonial period, but they were actually writing in English naman, right? So this is basically an exclusive space for Filipino writers. And part of the research that I'm currently doing is reading the Liwayway, and hence now my 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 chore of reading literary Filipino in this age when I can't even tolerate it. But what I found curious was that as early as 1942, in 2005 I didn't know this, but now I just realized Kenkoy, as its namesake, was actually published in Liwayway. And when you look at the histories of Tony Velasquez, they would say that Tony Velasquez stopped working in World War II in fear of propaganda. But what you actually see is he published 3 works. Kenkoy on its own in DIY, and the comic strips that I showed you. There would be 2 that he would do. Kalibapi Family, to those who are not familiar, Kalibapi is the only political party that was allowed to exist in the Japanese occupation period. So hence it becomes a propaganda tool. And then you have Neneng, one of the characters in Kenkoy itself. So it's quite surprising that why they stopped, why a lot of comic historians in the Philippines would say that there was no comics during this period. There's a third one. but I have to figure out who this guy is. That's published in DIY as well. But the what this then tells me is it gives you the difficult conversations of arts and creatives in a period that is problematic, right? If you were a if you're basically a comic artist in the pre-war period and you had no ways to earn an income, especially in war when economies were problematic, you had to now um, look for places where you had to earn money, and if it meant working for propaganda, so be it, right? Because that's the realities of this space. Of course, it means that I would now need to unpack the stories and the life of Tony Velasquez, but that's part. It's part of the conversations that we now have to deal with. That you can also work with the artists that were writing during this, the writers that were writing during this period as well, which also gives you the question of Jose Laurel, right? The president during this time, which our Philippine history would label as a collaborator, right? So it doesn't allow us to have these questions because of how we flattened the period into a single identity. Liborio Gatbonton, if you are familiar with him, is actually a very, very famous artist during the 1930s up to the late 1960s. The Gatbontons is an art family, and even up to now, they are still within the pursuance of art. But in the immediate post-war period, Liborio Gat would then write, after probably all of the garbage that he had to write for the propaganda, he actually published this Jappy Days in the Philippines in the 1950s, which then shows him doing a lot of grave insults to Japanese during this period, right? So it's his way of then coming to terms with his own World War II past. And it was his conversation to his audience that, look, I'm a graphic artist and I needed to earn a living during this period, right? But it's not me, right? One curious postscript that I'd have is, remember the Japanese the Japanese comic artist, the sole Japanese comic artist. When I pursued my PhD in Japan, my advisor tells me I was not supposed to do comics anymore, probably because I didn't think that there was going to be anything new to it. But my advisor tells me that, oh, Keiho Shimada is something that you have to explore. Why? Because he's actually a very famous Japanese manga artist in the 1930s. And one of the works that he would do, which was popular during that period, is Boken Dankichi, the one that you see here, talking about a Japanese national that goes to the South Seas. South Seas during that time was labeled anything that was to the south of Japan. So it may include the Philippines. And he would become the king of all of these natives. And these natives are actually colored in black. So you see a lot of these racial concepts that were there. But when Shimada Keizo was actually, after his brief stint in the Philippines in 1943, he would then go back to publish comics in Japan, and he would now try to change these racist imagery that he had of the people of the South Seas. And hence what you see here is Dankichi, his main character, who now flies to the South Seas and meets Filipinos, right? And sees that these Filipinos and their culture, so it explains the culture to the Japanese. And hence what we would isolate as someone who is supposed to be a tool for propaganda is now trying to humanize us to the Japanese populace by telling us that no, we're not savages. They're not here to civilize us because there was already civilization in the Philippines itself. So it becomes an interesting circle, at least for my own research path, and it creates more questions and it allows us to ask more questions about the space, about the comics that is there. Right. So just to add this, this is a big. If the students are more interested in doing World War II research, I also work for the Filipinas Heritage Library, particularly the Roderick Hall collection. Roderick Hall is an American that was interned, not in FEU, unfortunately. He was interned in UST, and with his parents, he was six. He was a child when he was interned, and he just recently passed. So the nice thing about the collection is it collects not only Filipino American but also Japanese sources on World War II. So it allows us to do more research on the period, what happened in our spaces, what happened in various places in the Philippines, and what happened in schools during this time, right? Because unfortunately for us, World War II, despite being only 3 years in Philippine history, has not been given that opportunity to push its relevance, right? In the recent times, I think Dr. Jose of UP has also now is part of the vast plethora of World War II scholars that are now complaining about how we're changing the 1,000 peso bill people into animals, and all of them I think are World War II personalities. So it's part of these conversations that we have to work with. So with that, I end with World War II is always there, right? I love this because it's this basically beg balagtas, trying to put relevance again, making relevance to history by showing us that comics does matter. Comics is not just for kids, and comics has potential. So with that, I leave the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Sir Karl, Professor Chua, for such insightful and very interesting, discussion about the Japanese occupation, the comics and cartoons during the Japanese occupation. And I'm sure our students here learned a lot from you. And yes, that's correct. Now we're open now for questions. If you have any questions, kindly type in your questions, especially for those who are watching in the live stream. You can also send in your questions. And of course, engage with our speaker this afternoon. Sir, I think one of the questions here, while listening to you, is that I know that this kind of webinars, I mean, specifically talking about the World War II Japanese occupation webinar. Aside from webinars, sir, what are your thoughts on how we can really get back the interest of the general public to go back and study more of the local history specific to World War II in a more engaging manner?
Well, for one thing, it's great that FEU actually does this. One of the important things that history is not just about nation and state creation. History is found in every space and in any space, to which even my challenge to the history majors of FEU is look at your World War II history. That's why I feel, it's sad for Ateneo, because if I give this to my students, what will they say? Oh, there were guerrillas in the Damo, and they were hiding. But remember that FEU, as what Mantrina had mentioned, FEU, LaSalle, and UST were places when a lot of these harsh killings were now happening. But we know the stories in a general space, but do we know who were there? Do we know what actually happened? Right? And these are part of hopefully the archives of FEU, to which no one is just unpacking. And that's part of the challenge, to unpack this, to read them, so that you're then able to see that the place that you're sitting in is where, this classroom, that if we do our face-to-face classes in the future, this is where a lot of the, a lot of the people were killed, and hence there's going to be a lot of mumu here. Right? So, it's that we try to create relevance in our everyday spaces. And we remove it from the concept of it's just about fighting, it's just about death.
Sir, thank you so much for that. And I think we can also discuss that perceived disconnect of the Gen Z now when it comes to the local history, specifically for the Japanese occupation. You mentioned it's a very short period. Maybe you might be remembering more of the Spanish colonial and the American colonial. Pero, I mean, in the picture nasa ng Japanese occupation. So what are your thoughts? What could be the reason for this kind of disconnect from this generation right now?
I'm going to be slightly controversial in my opinion, because I guess I sort of shifted my expertise from Japanese occupation period to world to Japanese studies. So I'm very critical towards how we do nationalist history. In other words, yes, it has value, but it only has value up to the point of our liberation. In other words, after we were liberated by the Americans, nationalist narratives make no sense. Why? Because when you look at our histories, it's always about trying to figure. It's a binary. You're trying to look at the evil other. In the case, it's the Spanish, the Americans, the Japanese. And when you then push it further, it creates a problem for us. It's great that you had that forum about with Dr. Diokno. This becomes a problem for martial law. Why? Because it's not nationalism. Why? Our enemy is now fellow Filipinos, right? It's Marcos, right? So how do you then try to reconcile this in a nationalist history narrative when you're used to the idea that the evil person has to be an other? And I throw this again in the sense that in World War II, on October 13, 1943, one of the comics that I was really happy, sorry, I did not show it here, was that the Japanese granted us unconditional independence.
Wow.
It was the first time that the Philippine flag was raised independently, yet our histories would then tell us that this is not legit because it is, it's within the puppet governments of the laurels. But it's part of all of these nuances. So to me, the challenge is about now questioning our periodizations, questioning our values. In the case of Dr. Diokno, she even questions the periodization based on precedents, personalities. Right? So we move away from that and try to then reimagine our Philippine history from a different space so that we can value even World War II.
Yes, thank you.
That's
Thank you, Sir Carl. I think we need another webinar for this altogether in that part of the discussion. Those are very interesting details that you mentioned. Sir, one of the comments here from the chat box is from Sir Ian Velasquez. He said, Sir Cheng, Chua, thank you for saying that Velasquez did not stop publishing contrary to most scholars say. This is Ian Velasquez, his grandnephew and curator of Kenkoy Comics.
Yeah, and thank you. And I really value, and it's so sad nga diba? We celebrate Tony Velasquez as the father of Filipino comics, yet we tell his narrative like he was active during American period and then biglang nawala. So parang the question there is, anong ginawa doon? Naubusan ba siya ng paint? Naubusan ba siya ng ink? No, it's about the lives of creatives. And it's that, diba? If I'm not mistaken, is it FEU as well that houses si Ikabod ba? One of these, parang one of your alumni as well. But anyway.
Yes. Nonoy Marcel.
So, these are, it's awesome, right? That you have all of these creatives in your space. And Ikabod is a martial law icon, right? Because he creates commentary about martial law. So, that's why I value this type of material. Because we tend to not look at it seriously when you have these artists and their works that actively try to engage more people than what we tend to think.
Yeah, and thank you, sir, again for showing us no the works of Tony Velasquez, and it really helps us understand the slice of life no that we had during the time, the propaganda, and of course the aesthetics as well no of his creations no. So I think there's a good question here from one of our freshmen students no, from FEU from the Tourism and Management Travels and Tours. Um, his question or the question of the student is, did the Japanese sponsored government commission the comics and cartoons on every newspaper during the era, or they have no freedom of the media or the press? He's a history lover now according to his poster. Yeah.
That's where the challenge lies there. Kasi how I did my research was, remember, I did the Tribune, yung isa-isa mong page, kasi wala yung pages ng newspaper na, look for the comics pages. So isa-isa mo yung hanapin eh. And for me, the awesome thing about World War II is that it's from 1942 to 1945. So you're just basically dealing with 3 years. With 3 years, and I was able to find all of these comics. Anything that had images, anything that was in panels was an interesting thing for me. So I was only able to see the Tribune. That's why for the now that I have access to Liwayway, I was able to see it. That Tony Velasquez was also published in Liwayway in a different format. Which fascinates me as well. But I'm not able to see copies of La Vanguardia because it was only circulated to the Spanish-speaking populace, so its publication was limited. And Taliba, I'm not sure. Probably Taliba was not as kept. But the curious thing here is, remember, we're focusing on the center. These are national publications. There were also newspapers that were published in big cities, and surprisingly, sorry, I don't mean to take offense here. Surprising to me, because I never thought of it as a center, Bicol has its own propaganda newspaper, to which it's only written in that language. I only was able to know that this exists because there were records by the propaganda officers that these were the propaganda that they're publishing in this newspaper in Bicol, but it's written in the local language that they're to which I wouldn't even know how to read it. So it's part of that challenge for people in that space to actually unpack it, to see where it is, because it's not here, and probably Manila will not value it because it's Bicol, but it gives you another history towards what was there, right? And they might have their own local comics. So there was not in terms of commission, the interesting thing here is the propaganda corps wanted to really do a mixed media offense, which means that convert all of the media into Filipino national language during that time. So it's not just comic artists. You also had writers in DIY. You also had movies. You also had music. If you go to the Philippines Heritage Library, they will also give you the recordings of the LPs that were written that were pressed in 1940s, so that you'll hear wartime music as well. But the massive offense here is you force everyone to speak in Tagalog, but it was a failure because the American educational policies of free education was quite successful, unfortunately. I may not see it. I haven't seen it as much. Filipino language pedagogy was not yet in its peak during this time, and hence it was difficult to sort of replace the American language pedagogy with Filipino language during that period.
You know what, sir? Carl, you keep on opening a lot of an extension to the discussion. This is really interesting, specifically about the language, the Philippine language pedagogy, and some of the barriers that you mentioned earlier. Sir, siguro a follow-up question to this, no? Aside from the content, no, of this comics, no, during the Japanese occupation, is it also part of your study to look into the aesthetics of this comics in terms of, you know, the express, the artistic expression, and how they actually connect to the audience or to the readers? Sir?
It's great. Yes, because when you look at it, uh, although I'm not really trained really in reading it from an aesthetic perspective, but part of the conscious effort of Tony Velasquez by using his characters, right? Kenkoy, Neneng, Tiniente, I forget their names. I'm so sorry, Mr. Velasquez, who's here. But part of it is the familiarity. Why? Because as media consumers, as Filipino media consumers, we actually reject things that are unfamiliar or experimental to us. And hence, part of the reason why his medium is successful is because he was consistent in using his aesthetics up to the from the American to the Japanese occupation period to the post American period. Right? Why he becomes iconic is because his style has not changed. His characters have not changed. The way they speak has not changed, right? That's part of it. And how I read it in my article in Philippine Studies was that's why Keizo Shimada, the Japanese artist, was rejected during this period. Was why? Kasi wala pang manga during that time, right?
Mm.
So people were familiar with American style aesthetics in comics, American builds, and so on. So the clean lines of this Japanese artist was something a little bit childish to the readers.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I quite found it surprising na wow. And when I read nga the memoir of Shimada Keizo, he found it insulting because he was rejected by Filipinos despite the fact that this is a very accomplished manga artist in Japan, right? But it's that it's part of that aesthetic movement, right? That's there. But if you do have scholars that can do this more line work, panel work, it's going to be an awesome experience just to analyze it from that space. Right?
Yes.
Even the fashion.
Correct. So I'm sure there are a lot of students here listening right now might be really interested to, you know, venture or maybe check on those aspects. No, I mean the aesthetics aspect, no, of the Japanese occupation comics. Sir, follow-up comment from Sir Ian Velasquez. He said that he's also now an MA in communication student, and his thesis will focus on Ponyang Halobaybay. And I'll just read this part now. We will also exhibit in June at the NCAA Original Comics Art, including Kalibati, Family Originals by Tony Velasquez. Yeah.
Yes, please do so. Actually, yun nga the sad thing here is that, and this is where I kind of disagree with a lot of the comic historians, is that Tony Velasquez has been limited to just Kengkoy. When the reality is, part of the then world creation of Tony Velasquez included how he was able to create sophisticated characters, right? So it's not just a one note thing. And yun nga, na parang there's so much that you can then see from him beyond his Kenkoy work. Great, and I do want to read it, and you know the exhibit itself, because the nice thing as well, and yes, and the nice thing as well is an exciting thing, and I hope I can get contact with Mr. Velasquez, is our next project's Filipinas Heritage Library is comics, and I'll sort of be managing it, because the sad thing for the Philippine space is we haven't started archiving a lot of this material. it's still within the families, and I do respect it. But at the same time, comics has been part of our histories. It's even as what Ma'am Tina or whoever it was that mentioned there, Marcelo and his Ichabod is also part of our history. Larry Alcala is also part of our histories, right? Yet we we know we don't study them as historical pieces, legitimate historical pieces, and that's part of why I pushed for this, right? Um, that I wanted to create a different image of Tony Velasquez just beyond just drawing a cartoon and a comic about Filipinos struggling with the American colonial period. It was basically the Filipino that was struggling from from the 1930s up to the 1960s. So it really gives you that long pang Love Diaz movie in comic form.
Oh, yeah. Sir, thank you so much. No, I think it's giving us helping us understand that we might want to go more of the works of uh, Tony Velasquez aside from Ken Koy, and explore more about the possibilities of how he can actually created an iconic and of course a very identifiable elements during that time that we can really look into and study further, sir. I think there's a good question again, sir. No, it's a direct question. I mean, one of the audiences here, no, anonymous, but he says here, no, or the question says here, no, good day, Sir Carl. While I'm studying East Asian history, I have learned that Asians generally focus more on history as a key figure for development rather than the Westerns focus on the future. In your perspective, do you think we lack understanding of our own history, that it hinders our development? Especially with the case of historical revisionism, rather, is very rampant in our country right now through different forms, including books, comics, and cartoons. Your thoughts, sir?
Great. Let me position this with the idea that we currently in our current society we have stained the idea of historical revisionism into a negative concept. In other words, right now when we talk about historical revisionism, it's context towards martial law and the Marcoses, right? However, please don't take me out of context here. However, history as a discipline has to constantly revise itself. Why? And that's where the first thing of my talk comes in, where history is about making people realign or revalue their past, present, and future, which is related to your question on development, right? Um, in probably let's say let's in the 50s and 60s, nationalism was an important thing for Filipinos. And that's why a lot of historians were writing about nationalist narratives. But in our current space right now, nationalism might not necessarily be that an important thing, right? It could be development, it could be gender relations. So, in other words, history now has to be about conversations. The difference is we do have a lot of Philippine historians that are writing. You read them. They have articles, excellent articles that are writing about commentaries on the Philippines and so on. But it has not changed our general history, and that's where my problem lies. When you look at it, to the students who have not seen it, I would advise you watch Dr. Diokno's webinar as well, because she tells you that part of the problem here, if you look at martial laws, your problem is sobrang haba ng focus natin sa pre-colonial to colonial spaces na history teachers could no longer even go to World War II, much more go to EDSA. Kasi, World War II is 1940s to 1945, and then you have the post-war problems pa. And with our short time periods of education, the choice, unfortunately, by a lot of history teachers is to cut the last parts, and that's why it's not really about us not knowing, but our histories are yes, we do have a sort of 400, no, 500, 600-year history, but we don't need to learn all of it, right? It's now about how our Philippine history is now going to shape us. Whether ang importansya dyan is in the American colonial period, then good, go ahead. If you want to look at martial law, then good, go ahead. That's now the value of the current generation. But that's what history is supposed to do, right? Development is another thing, Kasi when you say development, ano yung question ng development dyan? Are you looking at progress? Are you looking at, gender equality? Are you and it's also a loaded term, Kaya parang to me, rather than say that we are supposed to aim for development, it's about questioning, so what's now valuable to us? What not us, kasi I'm old. What's valuable to you, to the younger generation? Kasi when you grow up, what type of Philippines and Filipino do you want to be, right? During my time, it worked kasi I'm supposed to be this nationalist that loves the Philippines, that bathes with Philippine pride and so on. It was successful, but what type of society am I currently in? Is it good? Is it bad? So yun.
Yes, sir. I think aside from being interesting, no, it's good that you mentioned that history is constantly, revising itself, and yeah, that history cannot just maybe not be discussed in a linear sense, that it's interconnected, and of course, no, I mean, it's really something that it's really enticing, that inspiring us to really look into the different aspects of the history. Maybe those part that we might not be really discussing or not really part of the conversation, as you say earlier, as you said or mentioned, sir. Yeah, sir. Before we end our open forum, sir, can you give us some piece of advice to all of our students here who are, might be really interested to look into our history, and maybe what are the things that we might want to look forward in terms of studying the past? No, I mean, how the two are actually interconnected, sir. Thank you.
Just the very simple message to me is like, history is never boring. It's about you it's about you imagining how you want history to be told. In my case, I chose comics. There are so many Filipinos had been a culturally rich society even in the past, and we have not tapped to all of this in order to make it part of our histories, right? So it's not about discovering something new, but it's just basically adding to the picture that you now have, in my case, Tony Velasquez, telling Filipinos in a image format that there was suffering, there was this in World War II, right? So it's about creativity, in imagination, in history. And I do hope that the students can continue in that imaginative understanding of our past.
Thank you so much, Professor Karl Ian Cheng Chua, for such an engaging, inspiring, and of course, very insightful session with you this afternoon. Before we proceed with the closing remarks, we would like to present you first with this certificate of appreciation from the Far Eastern University. And this certification is awarded to Professor Karl Ian Cheng Chua, and we would like to thank you for your time. Now, of course, no, I mean, we learned a lot from you this afternoon, and of course, we would like to see more of your lecture series and your webinars, sir. And of course, our students here would be more than willing to know more about your study, and of course, open a lot of opportunities for us, no, for the students to go back and study history. Thank you so much again, sir. And on that note, again, I would like to call on, for the closing remarks of our program, the Director of the General Education Program, Miss Anansa Dihan. Anansa, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ron. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I wish to thank our resource speaker, Mr. Karl Chua. It was a privilege listening to you. It's both interesting and insightful to know how comics were during the Japanese occupation era. Who would have thought that we can learn pieces of history from comics? History indeed is not boring, like what you have mentioned. I'd like to share some personal key takeaways from our speakers sharing. First, we've learned that selected comics during that period were used to communicate the Japanese way of life to Filipinos, taking advantage of the popularity of that type of media. Combining the power of visuals and humor, indeed, a comic strip was an effective medium to impart a message. We also have seen sample comic strips, which we might have found funny for a minute, but after speaker sharing, it gave us a deeper understanding that behind the simple visuals of smiling kids, snoring fathers, and seemingly clueless Filipinos were the sad and probably dark stories of our fellow men under the Japanese control. I've actually read Mr. Chua's research, and it was mentioned there that the same Filipino cartoonists managed by the Japanese editors were the same ones who found a way to subtly criticize the propaganda. Indeed, more than brilliance, I call that bravery. It has been 75 years already since the Japanese occupied our country. However, decades may have passed, but looking deeper at the essence of today's talk, what happened before is still happening at the moment. The comics and cartoons are now memes. For all we know, we are still in the same situation wherein those in power might be using the popular media for propaganda purposes. And until we have someone like Mr. Chua who can study hundreds of these visual images, these hundreds of memes that we see and share, we couldn't really tell if we're being brainwashed to believe an idea or an information which may or may not be truthful. I wish to close by addressing most especially our dear students. Yesterday was the official start of the campaign period. We are being bombarded with audio, visuals, and text, telling promises of the future. My dear students, let's look beyond the entertaining images and sounds and let's be critical thinkers. Like the Japanese from our history, our current politicians know what to use effectively to promote an idea. Let's please learn from our past. It was mentioned by our speaker, let's question what we know, what we consume, and what we have been taught. I wish to ask the same question. What kind of Philippines do you want for your future? This may be cliche for you, most especially during this founding anniversary week, but we can never go wrong with going back to our values of fortitude, excellence, and uprightness. Again, I wish to thank our speaker, Mr. Karl Chua. Thank you as well to our organizers, our students, and our faculty members who joined us. I wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ma'am Anan Sadihan, for such interesting and of course inspiring and thought-provoking closing remarks. No, it's a good those are good questions now for us to ponder on as we progress. No, with upcoming elections. Thank you so much. So now some of our announcements for our students here, since this webinar is part of our Flair class, you can now see from the screen the QR code for the evaluation of our activity. Please make sure that you answer the survey so that we can get your comments and feedback for this activity. So kindly scan the QR code for this one. And also the evaluation link is actually posted on the chat box. Okay. We have other announcements aside from the evaluation form. We have also other classes. No? We have the further learning through alternative and reconfigured education happening February 10 to 11. Make sure that you maximize the time given to you to attend all alternative classes in celebration of the 94th Foundation Week anniversary of FEU. And don't forget not to scan the QR code, and also the link is also being posted here in our chat box. No? Okay, so let's maximize the learning again. Okay, next, we have also a lot of activities in store for this week. One of those activities will be for tomorrow, which is February 10 at 3 to 4 p.m. The Career and Placement Office will have a pre-employment preparation talk webinar series titled Timestamp, Time Management as an Essential Skill for Career Success. You are all invited, and this will also be live streamed via the official FEU Facebook page. And finally, we have also another here This one is for tomorrow as well, or for the entire week as well. No? So the film showing, Usapang Sine, Culture, Interdisciplinary, Nationalism, Education, film showing with open forum with filmmakers via Zoom. Please check the schedule. And of course, we are so excited that we will be learning a lot this week, no, in celebration of our 94th Foundation Week anniversary. Thank you so much again, everyone, for being here. It's such an honor to be, sharing this platform with our speaker, Professor Karl Cheng Chua, SVP Trina Trino. Thank you so much, ma'am, and of course, ma'am Anasa Dihan, and of course, the men and women behind this session. Thank you so much, Academic Development Office, Academic Affairs Office, EdTech. Thank you so much, and all the faculty, and of course, dear students, dear Tamaraos, who actually joined us in today's session and our webinar. On that note, may I ask everyone to please join us in singing the FEU hymn. This is again Ron Gascon, your moderator MC. Thank you. Stay safe. Be brave. Tamaraos.